Thank you. Sige, so good afternoon to everyone. So I'm Chippy Buenafe. In this capacity, I'm the moderator of the UANP Chess Club. Okay, and we're here to promote the idea of chess.
Si Garnet Aguilar po ba, teacher?
I'm sorry. So we're here to talk about chess, and it's in relation to education. So that's the intention today. Now we've split the group into two groups. So we have the students, the elementary school students on one breakout session, but we've also wanted to share something specific for the teachers, especially in relation to the educational aspects of chess, okay, as a tool or as an instrument to teach or help improve learning outcomes for children. Now, what's up ahead? I'll share concepts and how they relate to relevant ideas with respect to chess. So that's going to be perhaps the biggest portion of our session for today for teachers. And then towards the end, we'll talk about some pedagogical approaches as to how we use chess in actually teaching or inculcating certain ideas, values, principles, skills to children. So we'll go through that. Now, before we begin, I mean, as a warm-up, if you can see this chessboard in front of you right now, right? May question ako sa inyo, and just type it down in the chat box right now in Zoom. The question is, how many squares do you see in this chessboard? Sige, so let's just wait for everyone if you can type in the chat. Okay, how many squares can you see in the chessboard? Okay, may mga answer 64. Who else? Sige pa. How many squares do you see in the chessboard? 64, 64. Sige pa. So there's like a handful of you. Okay. Sino pa? Nabilang nyo na kung ilang squares? Okay. Somebody messaged me 200 108. Okay. 64. Okay. 64 nga ba? Okay. Sige. Okay. Well, that's the very first topic that normally we take a look into chess. No? So somebody said 204. Okay. 80. Okay. So somebody changed their minds. Okay. So now that you can see that even as a simple concept as a chessboard, you can actually start provoking ideas for the students, okay, on how to start thinking about things, okay? Like, okay, let's look at this chessboard, okay? How many black squares do you see on the chessboard? Ilang black squares meron on chessboard? Okay, if you can just type your answers in chat. Okay, and I'll share with you the answers later. Sige. Ilang black squares meron? 32, okay. Okay. Anybody else? Just type black squares. Okay, 32, 32, 32. Okay. Sige. But in any case, I mean, just to warm you guys up, you know, these are questions that if you've noticed, we haven't really made use of the concept of chess as a game yet. So we're not even playing chess right now. We're just using concepts of chess to actually provoke certain thinking. And we'll get to see in a little while what concepts of chess would actually lead to certain educational outcomes that we'd want to have with children, okay, in the first place. So just to answer the question earlier, okay, I mean, the first question was, um, how many squares are there in this chessboard? Okay. Some of you have answered 64. Okay. But that's actually a trick question because, yeah, it's 64 because bibilangin natin, it's 8 by 8. But that question, intentionally, it was phrased that way because it's meant to provoke a little bit of critical thinking. Why? Because if you take a look at the 64 squares, okay, those are the individual small squares. But what about the 2 by 2 squares? Diba? Hindi ba sila square din? So you can now see that there are many 2 by 2 squares. Pwede ring 3 by 3 squares. Marami ring 3 by 3 squares. Okay? Now, if you go through all of the counting permutations, you'd actually end up with the idea of 204. Okay? But the thing there is that 204, but you can even be a little bit sneaky because even the border outside, that's also a square. So pwedeng 205 yan. Okay? Or even if you want to argue yung puting white line na bordering the 8 by 8 chessboard, you can also consider that as another square. So you can have 206. Okay? But the whole idea there is that this image of the chessboard and that question actually provokes thinking. Okay? Critical thinking for the students. Now, the second question that I had earlier, how many black squares are there in the chessboard? Okay. If you've noticed, well, there doesn't seem to be, well, unless you're using a black and white TV, okay, which, okay, I guess I will be forgiven, but the image is actually color brown. So if you really want to be accurate with the thinking process, it's actually brown, not black. We're used to the idea that these squares, we tend to call them black because we have white and black pieces, diba, in chess. So we're thinking, okay, this is a white square, then the opposite is a black square. Okay. Properly speaking, we don't call them white or black. We call them light colored or dark colored squares. But they're not white, they're not black because, I mean, properly speaking, there's nothing black in the image. Okay. So now let's go and start off the idea of educational chess right now and how do you use certain chess concepts in teaching certain things to students or children. We'll start off with the very first concept, the chessboard. And sometimes as an educational tool, we tend to forget that the chessboard can be a very powerful tool in our efforts to teach children. Okay. And the very first concept that we can teach children with the chessboard is counting. So, like, for example, the earlier question that we had, how many squares are there in this chessboard? Okay, you can actually provoke thinking. Of course, when we say 64, we shouldn't be saying na mali ka. Hindi 64 ang tamang sagot. Of course, 64 because they can count it visually. Okay? But you want to provoke further thinking. Like, for example, hindi ba square din itong 2 by 2 na squares na ito? O itong 3 by 3 na to, hindi rin ba square to? So rather than telling them outright, oh, 64 is the wrong answer, rather than being discouraged, do you actually provoke them to think further? May iba pa bang squares dito na hindi ko nakita? And for some of you, if you've gone through the mathematical approach, you might have ended up with 204. Okay, but then if you are sneaky as I was earlier, you'd notice that the border outside can also be considered as a square. So the whole idea there is that you can use counting, okay, all of your counting exercises. You can use a chessboard to help provoke critical thinking in counting, okay, and trying to identify how it works. Now, another concept about the chessboard that we can teach to children is the idea of geometry. Okay? And it's quite obvious perhaps in a certain sense when we start looking at how the game is played. But even just the chessboard itself, it's enough that they understand the idea, the basic ideas of geometry by just looking at the chessboard. Take note, we haven't placed the pieces there. We're just looking at a 8 by 8 board, okay, without any pieces, and yet we can determine geometry. Now, what are the things that we can find out in geometry? Well, the first one is space. You introduce them to the idea of space. Eventually, when we start putting pieces there, they will realize that the space actually shrinks. Okay, that the space is occupied and there's open space. Okay, and later on, when you start to play the game, you will understand that there are certain spaces that you don't want to occupy, and there are certain spaces that you'd like to occupy. Okay, so but the whole idea there is that the concept of space in geometry, you can start using the chessboard to appreciate that concept better. Now, another idea in geometry is categorization. So earlier I said about the black squares, okay, but properly speaking, we call them dark squares or light squares, the opposite of the dark squares. So now they get to determine, okay, these are light squares, these are dark squares. So you are able to categorize. Okay? You're helping children categorize. Okay, this is a dark square. This is a light square. Okay. Eventually, in relation to counting, when you talk about the movements of the knight, which we will talk in a little while, you'll notice that the knight, if it starts from a light square, its next move has to be a dark square. And when it moves to a dark square, the next move that the knight will do will actually be the light square. So there's that alternating pattern. So not only do they see categories, they also determine patterns, geometric patterns. And that is something that you'd like the students to build, okay, through the use of the tool that is just the chessboard. And lastly, you get to have definitions. You get to have definitions of a square. You can also try to have definitions of a rectangle. You can have definitions of combinations. Okay. And in fact, when we talk about combinations or definitions for that matter, you are also identifying boundaries, which is also important in geometry. Okay, so this is your edge. This is outside of the area. This is inside the area. So you get to define your boundaries as well. And for that, when we start teaching chess, okay, as an educational tool and using the chessboard as the very first concept, you'll realize that there's more to it than just as a simple chessboard. You can introduce the idea of a square. You can introduce the idea of a vertical or a file or horizontal, a rank. Okay, something that Billy earlier for the kids, he tried to introduce. The concept of a diagonal. Okay, so diagonal would be, okay, if they're all light colored, they're all dark colored. You can combine it with counting. Like, for example, how many diagonals are there in a chessboard? Okay. So do you consider a single square as its own diagonal? Okay, so yung mga ganong questions. No? So you can start introducing these ideas and help provoke thinking for further purpose. Okay. Now you can talk about the center or the bigger center. So the center would be the 4 squares in the middle of the board. So if we use, later on, we'll talk about coordinates. If you have D4, D5, E4, E5, that would be your center. Or you can have the concept of a bigger center, which is the 4x4 square in the middle of the board, which would be bounded by C3, C4, C5, C6, D3, D4, D5, D6, E3, E4, E5, E6, F3, F4, F5, F6. So that's your bigger center. So now they understand, okay, so the center is here, there's a bigger center around it, okay, and then you have the concept of the edge. So the edge would be defined as your first rank and eighth rank, the A file and the H file. Okay. Then you have the concept of the king side and queen side. So this would be the number of squares, sorry, not that number, the squares that are on one half or the other half. So for example, king side, you'd refer those squares that are on the E file, F file, G file, H file. in all of the ranks. Queen side would refer to the A file, B file, C file, D file in all of the ranks. So now you can see those categorizations. There are 32 squares. Okay? You can also take a look at corners, which would be just those 4 squares, the corners. A1, A8, H1, H8. Okay? And lastly, coordinates, how we identify those squares. So without the coordinates, they're just simple squares. You don't really know the value in a way of those squares, not unless you give them like labels to identify their own relative positioning with the other squares. So just the chessboard, there are already a lot of things that you can start introducing to kids, okay? As regards counting, as regards geometry. Now we move on to the second concept, which is about the pieces. Now in chess, there are 6 important pieces. Okay. And based on the research done in educational chess, you'd like to introduce the pieces according to this order that I'm sharing with you right now. You start with the king, the rook, the bishop, the queen, the knight, and finally the pawn. So that is how you'd like to order them. But there are 6 pieces. Okay. Now, what can be taught by just introducing the idea of the pieces? Well, first of all, we introduce the idea of rules. Each piece would have what is known as a valid move. Okay. For those of you who are familiar with the basics of chess, at least at the minimum, you would know these valid moves. Okay. But the idea of rules comes into the picture. You can actually tell them that people need to follow rules in order to have an enjoyable game, in order to have a very good experience. Well, rules have to be followed. Okay. So right now we're really not zeroing in on chess. We're just zeroing in on the application or the use of chess concepts to appreciate certain values. Okay. In fact, that is also going to be one of the things that's taught about in etiquette of chess. The idea of rules, that there are valid moves, that are invalid moves. Okay. And you can talk about these rules with respect to each of the pieces that you see in front of you. Now, another idea here is that you want to introduce the concept of roles. These are 6 different pieces. They have different rules governing them, okay? But they have their own role to play in the single game. Okay. So you obviously know that the king is the target. Okay, we'll talk about that in a while. But they have their own roles to play, they have their own functions. And as it is, from a values education perspective, you can also start teaching the kids the idea of roles, okay? That there are different roles to play, okay? So the first thing that you want to highlight is the importance of cooperation and coordination, okay? In chess, when you play chess, if you want to win the game, it has to happen that you want to coordinate your pieces in order for you to win the game, okay? It's very, very difficult for you to win a game with just using just 1 or 2 or just 3 pieces. Okay? Even. You will understand that as the game progresses, there is that level of coordination and cooperation that's required from the pieces themselves. Okay? So you actually teach children the role and the importance of cooperation and coordination. Okay? You also introduce them in a way what is called in the field as interdisciplinary chess. And an example of this would be you can highlight the role of history and politics. If you've noticed, the names of the pieces are actually based on medieval titans. Now, in the case of the Philippines, we probably cannot associate this as much. Okay, perhaps very, very secondarily lang. Like for example, the king and the queen, of course, back in the Spanish era, in the 16th century onwards, I mean, we were under the king and queen of Spain. But we're living in the 21st century after 500 years. We don't have that concept in our psyche. Kumbaga, no? So, but then we can relate it to other hierarchical roles in society. Okay. So, for example, in the case of at least your institution, you have the principal, okay, and the teachers who are figures of authority, or you can move it in a municipal level or city level. You have the mayor, okay, and the city council, or you can move it at the national level. You have the president, the vice president, the senate. Okay. So that's where you can start introducing the idea of politics or even history. Okay, history about chess itself, but history also of the hierarchical roles: the king, the queen, okay, the bishop. Okay, uh, and the titles are important because it's good to note that the piece, for example, the piece called bishop, it's not called bishop in the earlier days of chess many centuries ago. In fact, in other countries like Russia, the translation for the piece for bishop is not actually bishop, it's elephant. So now you have the horse, which is the knight. Okay, the bishop is the elephant. So, and the idea of the elephant is that it was also based perhaps from the original idea of chess coming from India, where they have elephants. Okay, but now we just use bishop to designate that piece. But historically, bishop is not bishop. Okay, it was elephant. And even in Russia, in the current translation of the language right now, they call that piece as the bishop. So even from the concept of the game itself, you can understand that the bishop versus the elephant, they have different roles in different contexts. Okay. So their appreciation of the game would also be dependent on the titles that you give to the pieces. Okay. But I won't go into at length on the specifics of that, but it's good to note that when we want to teach children the roles of authority in politics and the coordination of citizens in a particular society, well, chess can be a very good instrument to highlight that idea. Okay. And as I said earlier, when it comes to coordination and cooperation, there's also the importance of appreciating diversity. Okay. Okay. So there's diversity in thinking. You know that you cannot win with just all kings or all rooks or all bishops. Okay. You definitely would want to have all of these pieces on the board. Okay. It helps you appreciate that there's more strength in a composition of something that is more diverse. Now we go to the third concept, okay, which is pertaining to outcomes. Okay, and in chess there are two basic outcomes. It's either checkmate or stalemate. Okay. Now the checkmate, the most important move or action that would lead to checkmate is the concept of a check. Okay, so obviously in chess you will have to define what is a checkmate, what is a check, what is a stalemate. Something that Bailey introduced also to the students. But there are other outcomes that have been a fruit of the development of chess as a sport. For example, the outcome called resignation. Okay. That's accepted. Okay, nobody is forced to play the game until a definite outcome, which is a checkmate or a stalemate. Okay, players can resign. Or there could be outcomes that can lead to a draw. Okay. So there are two draws right now that's recognized aside from stalemate, draw due to insufficient material. So it's like if you're left with just kings on the board, well, there's no stalemate there because you can still move the pieces around. But you cannot have a checkmate scenario. So that is a draw. Okay. Or you can have a draw, which is what is known as a threefold repetition. So if you come up with the same position 3 times out of the entire game, it need not be consecutive. But as long as that position has been seen 3 times throughout the game, that is considered as a draw. Okay. And of course, there are other outcomes that are based on time control. Okay, chess at its core can be played without time limits. People can play chess for as long as they want until they reach an outcome. But of course, due to practical reasons, you put time controls. Okay. So you can see that another concept from chess that can be used to start introducing certain ideas would be outcomes of chess. And the very important idea that we can share here is the idea of goals. Okay? You can start teaching children about goals, about targets. Okay? And one way to express this would be, well, trying to give them motivation. Okay. Obviously, this is extra game, meaning this is outside of the game, but you want to ask them, why do you want to play chess? because I want to beat my classmate, I beat my friend, because I want to learn. Okay, those are motivations, those are goals. You can help them understand and appreciate their own motivations through the game of chess. Okay. Another would be reaction, especially once you have an outcome, you start to ask them or debrief what was your reaction to the game. If you won the game, then fine. Okay, it's something that's probably something that you'd want to happen. Okay, and but if you lost, what are you going to do? Will you feel sad or will you feel angry? Mapipikot ka ba? Will you just throw the chessboard up in the air? Okay, this is also an opportunity to see their reactions to certain outcomes. Also, you can actually take a look at an opportunity to reflect. Why is it that the outcome came to that point? Paano sila dumating sa outcome na yun? Okay, and that's important also because it helps them understand the mistakes that they did as to why they lost or the mistakes that the opponent did that made them win. So chess is also an opportunity to help them reflect on what happened after something has been completed, typically in a game. So obviously, when you play chess, you don't just simply say, okay, tapos na, we go on with our merry ways. No. You give them the opportunity to say, okay, natapos na yung game, you won, paano mo nagawa? Start making them do some reflection on what happened. Okay, natalo ka, you lost. Okay, don't go. Don't play a new game yet. Understand what happened. Why did you lose? Okay, these are opportunities that would help students, children in particular, not to jump the gun right away, and have them give them that opportunity to learn from their own mistakes or to learn their own strengths as well. Okay, or learn from the mistakes of the other side. Okay, so that they themselves will not make that mistake in the future. Okay. Now, the last concept that I'd like to teach you would be tactics. So this is a little bit more advanced. Okay, and how this would be introduced by the teachers would be different. But there are 3 basic tactics that are normally taught, okay, for children. The idea of a double attack, the idea of a pin, or the idea of a discovered attack. Now, double attack is that when a player moves a certain piece, okay, it actually creates threats, okay, more than one threat at the same time. So a typical fork, for example, let's say if a knight, okay, is moved to a piece and there are certain pieces, 2 pieces or more, that are under attack or under threat, as they say, or a pin. A pin is something that is put in a situation wherein you cannot move a piece. Either it is illegal to do so, okay, in the case of an absolute pin, or in the case of a relative pin, wherein a piece is actually blocking off a bigger piece or a more important piece that can be captured if that piece is moved. Okay. So the concepts of relative pin and absolute pin can also be considered here. And the idea of discovered attacks. And normally this is the inverse of a pin. So when I make a move, okay, that move is a little bit indirect because as I move that piece, I actually uncover another piece that I didn't move, which now becomes an attacking piece. So that is the concept of a discovered attack. Now, you've noticed that there's an ellipsis there. There are many tactics in chess, especially at the grandmaster level. For example, opposition, Zugzwang, Zwischenzug, things like domination. Okay, so a lot of these things can be taught, okay, to students, but obviously the ones that can be taught at a much younger level would be these 3 tactics. Okay, and they're easy to illustrate. You can show them in the board and it makes things simple. Now, what can be taught here? Well, the idea of evaluation. Okay. In fact, for those of you who are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, right? So there are knowledge, skills, application. Evaluation would be at the higher level, right? Along with synthesis and the likes. So by teaching them chess tactics, okay, the opportunities of a double attack or a pin, whether if it's an absolute pin or relative pin, or discovered attack, you get to notice that it gives the students an opportunity to evaluate the position. What would be examples? Okay, you actually force the students or the kids to do some calculation. Okay, it's not enough they just simply do random moves. Obviously, there are moves that are good, there are moves that are better, there are moves that are best. In the end, when you have to make the move, what type of move do you want to do? Is it just going to be a good move? Is it just going to be a better move, or will it be the best move? So you actually force the students, the kids, to calculate. Okay. Now, sometimes the calculation can have certain depth. They can take a look at things in maybe just one move ahead, two moves ahead, or for the more advanced students, hopefully they can do calculations as far as four moves ahead. Okay. If they can do calculations four moves ahead, that's actually very sharp. Okay, that's actually competitive level already, right? You can they can already foresee a lot of possibilities after four moves. That's quite dynamic already. But for certain children, they can probably only look one move ahead or two moves ahead. That's fine. You're not forcing them to really learn chess as a whole. You're forcing them to calculate. Okay, so if they can only do one move ahead, then slowly build the idea of looking two moves ahead, and later on three moves ahead. Okay. Now, of course, grandmasters can already look like 8, 9 moves ahead. Okay. Now, if your children, if the students can actually reach that level, then that's good, right? But that's not the point of educational chess. The point of educational chess, it's more of the journey rather than the destination. So you want them to do calculations in this case. Now, another idea in evaluation is sacrifices and compensation. Once they start capturing pieces, which is also a rule in chess, they will understand that you don't just simply do equitable captures, like I exchange my piece and then later on the next move, the other opponent just exchange an equivalent piece. Okay, there are certain captures wherein what was captured is less compared to the other. Okay, so the idea of a sacrifice. Okay, and the idea of compensation. If I do that sacrifice, what do I get in return? Now, sometimes children, as they're growing up, they only see what is in front of them, which is tangible, which is material. That's why they only look initially the idea of material advantage. I have more pieces than the opponent. Okay lang yan. That's a good start. But later on, they realize in the whole dynamics of the game, it's not just about having more pieces than the other. Of course, having more pieces is an advantage because that can actually lead you to an outcome that is better than yours. Okay, so remember outcomes. Okay, so the idea of compensation comes into the picture. So if I make this move, if I'm willing to trade off my bigger piece, my more important piece, what is the compensation that I get in return? And will that actually lead me closer to an outcome that I want? You help them go through that in chess. Okay, and later on in life, they will see that there will be trade-offs. There will be things that I cannot do, but if I don't do them, then I actually get something in return later on, which is of far better value. Okay, so you introduce the idea of sacrifices in chess. Okay, and also in evaluation, you also make them appreciate position and influence. Because chess, while theoretically you can play alone, right? But it's really dishonest if you play solitaire chess. I mean, you know what you're thinking, right? And you know what your opponent is thinking because it's just you. But in a typical game of chess, two players, position and influence, okay, is also learned through chess, through tactics. Why? Because you can actually influence the other player to make a move that would be to your advantage. Okay. And that's what they learn also in chess. They create a position wherein it forces the other opponent to make mistakes. Okay. So in a competitive situation, okay, they understand, okay, if I do this, I have better advantage and I can also lead my opponent to do a worse option. Okay. Now, this might not sound very sexy in the sense that, you know, we're supposed to be happy. We're all supposed to enjoy the game. You know, this sounds very manipulative, right? This sounds very shrewd or devious. No, why do we want to force the other person? Well, there are certain benefits in creating influence. Okay, while you are trying to influence your opponent to actually make a mistake, the lesson that can be learned here is that they can create an environment, a situation that can lead to positive outcomes, right? In fact, that's what leaders do. And this is where the concept of leadership comes into the picture, wherein if they become leaders, they need to create an environment wherein everyone can do their best. So it's not a direct action that's happening there. Okay, it's influential. And they can learn that through chess. Okay, influencing the position to reach an outcome that is beneficial for them. Now, those are the basic concepts in chess. Okay, there are a lot more that we can do. So, but I'm gonna touch a little bit on some pedagogical approaches as we're closing this part, right? So the first idea here is that number one, I'm not going to teach you competitive chess. When we say competitive chess, the idea behind competitive chess is that you want to learn chess as an end itself, right? You're learning chess because you want to compete, you want to become a grandmaster someday. Okay, that's competitive chess. But the idea of educational chess is that you want to use chess as a means to an end other than chess. Does that mean that educational chess does not lead to competitive chess? No. In fact, that is why a lot of the Russian countries have been very, very good in competitive chess because they've been actually good in educational chess. So there is that link. But the idea of educational chess is not to compete in chess. It's to actually learn the values and merits of chess for other things in life. And in that sense, the whole idea behind educational chess, especially as we're trying to do it, is the notion that we have to learn to crawl before we can walk and run. So we start with the little things first. If we want our students to maximize or capitalize the values of educational chess, you want to start slow. The concepts that I've shared a while ago, breaking them down into 4 general categories, right? That's a start. Okay. And you don't really have to dive in right away. In fact, if you've noticed, you might start to play the game a little bit on the 3rd concept, which is the outcome. Okay. But on the first concept about the board, there's nothing there about playing chess yet. It's just the chessboard. Or about the pieces, yeah, you're starting to introduce the rules behind it, but you're not even playing it. Okay, you're just making analogies, for example. So we will start with the crawling first before the running. Okay. So how does this play out? Okay, what are the examples? Okay. Well, for example, we've seen this. If we're going to use a chessboard, well, we can use it as a mathematical example. Okay. Of course, there are other examples that you can use for mathematics, okay? But of course, when you use chessboard as a mathematical example, that's a typical mathematical example, okay? Even if the person is not playing chess, at least they're familiar with the idea of a chessboard, okay? So that's a good start. Use a chessboard as a mathematical example and use it extensively, okay, for a purpose. Now, for the pieces, we can use the concepts like learning centers. So if you're familiar with a learning center, like in a physical area, there are certain spots that highlight a certain topic. You call them learning centers. So in the case of the 6 pieces, you can probably have 6 learning centers. And each student would, try to say something about the king. What is a king? Okay, what does a king do in real life? Okay, who are the past kings? So now you can start introducing the ideas of a king or the idea of a bishop. Who are the examples of a bishop? Okay, what does a bishop do? Okay, and you can make them be involved in a lot of creative activities, artworks, cutouts, posters here and there. Okay, and that's how they also learn. But you're using the ideas of chess to actually promote those types of learnings in a learning center. Now, another example here would be if you're familiar with the 6 thinking hats of De Bono, okay, because of the diversity of the pieces, then you start to think, okay, I need to start to think differently also. Okay, so the pieces would actually give you the idea about the De Bono's thinking hats. Another example that's used in other countries in this respect would be using the 6 thinking hats in relation to one piece. So for example, if I were to do the 6 thinking hats, let's say for the knight. So I look at the 6 thinking hats with respect to just the knight. So what's the fact about the knight? What's my feeling about the knight? Okay. What are the positive things about the knight? What are the negative things about the knight? So you start to give them that opportunity to do lateral thinking through the bono for just one piece. Okay. So if you have more familiarity with the six thinking hats of the bono, Edward de Bono, you can actually make use of the chess pieces as an example to illustrate the value of the six thinking hats. Okay. Another approach here would be mini games. Okay. And I'd like to share with you some ideas of mini games, because when we want to use chess as an educational tool, we don't want to use all of them for the sake of, or use the entire game. We don't make them play the entire game. We just come up with mini games. And I will stop sharing and I'll share a little bit on examples of a mini game. Okay. Let's see. So for example, this mini game, if you can see my screen right now. Okay, so this is the example of a hungry game. Okay, so Hungry King. So this is an example done in Ireland. Hungry King. So you have to capture certain pieces. The first one that completes all of their assigned color, winner. In this case, you see that the only piece that's being used would be the king. I think you get the idea for this one. Another example would be the horse dropping. So this time you're using the knight to actually illustrate capturing the entire board, for example.
Horse dropping. Every time a horse is on a place, it lets an horse dropping. Horses will never jump into a horse dropping. There are two kinds of wins. Win one, you hit the other horse. Win two, the other horse can't move. Let's see how it works.
So here you can start to see that the board is slowly being filled up. So now the player is starting to think, what would be my next few moves so that I still have some move left afterwards, okay? Because your turn ends if you can't move to another square, okay? Because of the droppings. It's a little bit crude, though. Droppings, you probably have a very crude image of what a dropping is for a horse, right? So you can use footprint if you don't want to use droppings. Okay. I get to see the ideas. Okay. Okay, and then we'll talk about this. Okay, so you have the knight versus the queen.
The black
Okay, so they try to
Who wants
capture each
snatch
other.
The white horse. Let's see if it works.
Okay, so if you've noticed, we're not using all of the pieces in chess, okay? But you're already introducing ideas of geometry, of space, okay? Trying to evaluate the situation ahead of time, okay? You can see the tactics behind it, okay? Okay, okay, so now wherever the knight would go, the next move would, the knight would be captured.
Let's change the
So
colors.
that's it. And then lastly, the something
Ball starts.
like a catch the
Please
flag.
change places. The white king wants to get on the black throne, on the blue throne, and the black king wants to get on the red throne. And now we begin. It's very important for opposition. White moves.
So it's like a capture the flag, okay? Okay,
And white has won.
okay, so those are examples of mini games that you can actually introduce to children. Okay. Now, another pedagogical approach would be the jigsaw approach. Okay. So in the case of outcomes, if you want to teach, let's say, how do we come up with a checkmate, you can actually ask individuals to talk something about it and then report in class, maybe, or report in a group. So they do their work. And all of the individual works of people, you can actually come up with a better whole, right? So you can ask them, okay, about the pieces. For example, you can do a jigsaw approach for the pieces. Okay, you talk about the king, you talk about the queen, you talk about the knight, the rook, and then we gather all of those outputs together to come up with a topic about pieces. Okay, so that's one way to look at the outcomes. You can take a look at the jigsaw approach. Okay. Another approach would be group work, which is we're very much familiar with. This time with tactics. So you try to teach them, okay, explain the idea of a discovered attack. So they might have some samples in mind to give illustrations of a discovered attack. Okay, so group work would be an approach that would help them appreciate the examples of tactics of a pin, an absolute pin, or relative pin. Okay. And then even the idea of a lesson plan. Okay, lesson plans, this is something that's particular to us as teachers, but even for students, by teaching them the concept of a lesson plan, you want them to have something structured in mind. Okay, and that's the idea of a lesson plan, okay, for them. So start thinking about their plans. Okay, this is my goal, this is my target, lay everything down. Okay, you're actually teaching them tactics. Okay, and even the idea of a flipped classroom. Okay, so the idea that, as teachers, there's this tendency that we're the authority, so we're the ones going to teach. It's a one-way passive thing. But the concept of a flipped classroom is that you want to reverse the roles. This time, you want the students themselves to take leadership and actually teaching the idea to their other fellow students. Okay, bringing up the idea of a flipped classroom. So that these are approaches that you can use to actually promote educational chess in your own area. Okay. So those are the approaches, some of the approaches. There are many more approaches we can probably think of, but the whole idea here is that educational chess is a very important tool that we can use to actually accomplish certain outcomes that we want to happen or to accomplish with our children, okay, with our students. So now the question here is, will we answer the call? And just to wrap up, I'd like to propose an idea here, okay? For this school year, especially for FMMES, here's what we'd like to do. Okay, let's try to identify the students who will attend the activities of the UAAP Chess Club. Okay, we'll have ways of monitoring it. And we'd like to gather some baseline metrics, maybe let's say their grades from the previous year, okay, just to establish the baseline of their scholastic performance. Then let's give educational chess a try. Let's have them play chess, learn a little bit about it. You as teachers try to introduce a little bit of activities. Okay? And then we gather metrics at the end of the school year. Okay? And let's try to see whether using chess can actually help improve motivation, improve their ability to follow rules, okay, build virtues or values, okay. And that's what we'd like to accomplish with educational chess. Okay. And with that, okay, I will end here. And of course, thank you very much for all the support and the attention that you've given to us at UANP, and especially for the UANP Chess Club. So I'll stop here and then I'll turn the ball over to who's moderating this. Camille, ba? Okay.
So thank you so much for that, Sir Chippy. Kenji and I were just watching your talk. So thank you again. We will be going back to the main session. So please stay afterwards just for the closing remarks. And yes, so see you in the main session. Thank you po, everyone.
Thank you. Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to message me. Okay. Thank you.